I was a homicide detective for 16 years, and then I traded the badge for a small brass nameplate on a glass door that read Private Investigator. I learned two things in uniform that followed me into civilian work. Violence carries a smell, and lies have a texture you can feel when you turn the page of a report. I say that because the stories you are about to hear are not tabloids or rumor mill fodder. They are 5 separate investigations I opened after someone walked into my office with fear in their voice and a mess of paperwork on their lap. I will tell you what I found, how I found it, and what it cost the people involved. I will also explain the processes we used, the mistakes that were made, and why sometimes the chain of custody or a failed search and seizure motion can mean the difference between an indictment and a dead end. These cases took me from suburban living rooms into warehouses that smelled of bleach and oil, from quiet operating rooms into courtrooms where testimony cracked like glass, and from phone taps that revealed only whispers into confrontations that should have never happened. I will keep this close to the facts so you can judge for yourself, and I will not sensationalize the victims because respect and precision are part of my method. This is told in first person because I was there in every step, and I will give you the documents, the audio descriptions, eyewitness accounts, and the forensic summaries that tied the stories together or left them hanging. The day I opened my office, the city had already labeled me an oddity, a former detective who would not accept retirement as an ending. I did not plan to become a private investigator. I planned to stop at the precinct, collect my retirement, and garden. Life took a different turn when a case I had worked on 15 years earlier came back as an open wound. The family wanted answers. They had gone through the bureaucratic motions and found inertia. They wanted someone with investigative muscles and a sense for procedural detail to reopen leads that had been ignored. That desire pulled me back into active inquiry in a different form. My first months were filled with routine surveillance calls, background checks, cold calls to old contacts at the county police, and a lot of slow work. Trawling public records, filing requests, and building rapport with reluctant witnesses. I learned that as a PI, you are both the calm voice and the person who will run through the rain at midnight to get a photo. My office sat above a laundromat on Main Street, a single window that framed a crooked church steeple, and on bad nights, the hum of dryers became a metronome for my decisions. I hired a part-time assistant, Lisa Ortega, who did document work and calls. I kept one reliable contact at the State Crime Laboratory, Lab, Dr. Helen Park, who would answer my emails at odd hours. My former partner, Detective Marcus Reed, would occasionally share a file when the case involved his old jurisdiction. Those names became touchstones, and you will hear them again as witnesses and as people who both helped and hamstrung investigations. I took cases for money, of course, but I took the ones that mattered because I could not stand the idea of another family walking away with only questions. My backstory is not an origin story of heroism, but of restlessness and a particular habit of paying attention. As a child, I was the kid who watched from the window, who cataloged comings and goings on our street, and who learned early that you can tell a lot about someone by the shoes they leave at the door. I joined the force because I wanted to be useful, and because my father, an emergency room nurse, taught me to inventory consequences. Those early lessons shaped how I handled witnesses and how I read a crime scene. My training in the academy taught method and discipline, but it was the years on the streets that taught timing and tone. I worked homicide, undercover assignments, and a stretch on surveillance detail where I learned to sit still until the moment you have to move. I left the force because the bureaucracy grew thick around good intention, and because a case of mine was mismanaged by oversight and politics. I lost a friend in that case, and I have not forgiven the process for that. The loss pushed me into private work, not to make money, but to exercise the kind of diligence I believed the system sometimes refused to grant. In private practice, I could take the time to build a case, to protect evidence, and to cultivate testimony without being told to close a file for administrative convenience. Those years of loss and patient work are why I still keep a small notebook of names I will never forget. The first of the 5 stories began as what seemed like a routine domestic suspicion and quickly became something far more sinister. Maria Alvarez came to me in late autumn, clutching a grocery bag full of receipts and screenshots from her husband, Tomas Alvarez's phone. She said Tomas was disappearing every Sunday afternoon and returning with his hands smelling faintly of antiseptic and with a new bruise on his forearm. She wanted proof of infidelity, but she feared for his safety because he had become withdrawn and secretive. We set up surveillance the first week. I followed Tomas from a coffee shop near the river to a rented storage unit on the industrial edge of town. The unit number was nondescript, but a neighbor named Tom Briggs remembered a series of vehicles that arrived in the night. I did 6 hours of stakeout, the smell of stale cigarette smoke and street oil burning into my clothes, the taste of instant coffee bitter in my mouth. On the third night of observation, a woman named Emma Clark, who worked part-time at the laundromat across the street, texted me a photo from her window. The photo showed Tomas entering the unit with a duffel bag and leaving hours later with his hands clean. That pushed me to escalate our surveillance protocol. We deployed a parabolic microphone and a small body camera disguised as a jacket button. The audio we captured was chilling, but not in the way you expect of romantic betrayal. I will quote the exchange as best as I can from the transcribed file because this dialogue mattered in court and in the inquiry that followed. "You sure he can handle this?" a male voice said. "He will, or there will be trouble," a second voice replied. "No phones," a third insisted. "Cash, then," the first voice answered. "And keep him sedated if he resists," the second said. "I do not want blood," the first voice answered softly. "We do not get paid for squeamishness," the second concluded. That 6-line exchange was the first of many. We had multiple exchanges that night, and each one layered intent. The sensory detail of that scene remains with me. The metallic click of the storage door, the muffled shuffling of canvas, the faint smell of rubbing alcohol and bleach, and Tomas's voice when he spoke, thin and rehearsed. Those details transformed presumptions. What began as a suspected affair progressed into an accusation of coerced medical procedures done without consent. We had witness Emma Clark, who had seen comings and goings, Tom Briggs, the neighbor, who recalled van registrations, and a payment trail from Maria that suggested falsified invoices. The evidence was circumstantial at first, but compelling when tied together. The second case I called the parabolic capture. It started as a routine assignment for a small clinic investigation. A local clinic had a reputation for fast procedures and faster answers. A man named Paul Henderson walked in with an X-ray and a story that made the nurses laugh politely until he broke down. Paul claimed that after a minor procedure, he had developed seizures of memory where he could not recall entire afternoons, and that he suspected someone at the clinic was running sedatives to patients and then selling their personal information. It was puzzling on paper, but it became urgent when a whistleblower nurse reached out to me via an anonymous tip line. Her name was withheld for security, but she described irregular medication logs and a physician who refused to sign a controlled substances inventory. We did not have probable cause for a search and seizure, so we set up passive surveillance with thermal imaging and a parabolic microphone to capture conversations in the break room. The audio was grainy at first, but when we enhanced it, we heard an exchange that I will paraphrase because the words matter. "You moved the scripts," one voice said. "I moved them." Another voice answered. "Who is on the list?" the first asked. "Names, dates of birth, and the little notes," the second said dryly. "Keep the chain tight, or the lab will ask questions," the first cautioned. There were 8 such turns of speech that night, and each one built a pattern of supply and distribution that the prosecutor later called presumable trafficking. The forensics work that followed involved subpoenaing medication logs and conducting a detailed audit of pharmacy invoices. We prepared a report explaining how a broken chain of custody in the pharmacy inventory could allow for unauthorized removal of controlled substances. The technical description for the jury was necessary and precise. In forensic terms, we had to prove a divergence in the inventory ledger and present the lab with a documented chain of custody to show how tablets could be diverted. The audit revealed discrepancies totaling hundreds of pills and invoices with dates that did not match electronic timestamps. My contact at the State Crime Lab, Dr. Helen Park, provided a brief forensic explanation that I summarized for the court and for the report. That explanation was concise and grounded in method. It emphasized documentation of every transfer of evidence, sealed evidence bags with unique identifiers, and a strict log of handlers, so that when a sample or item is presented, it can be correlated to every person who possessed it. Those procedures may seem bureaucratic, but they keep evidence admissible, and they protect victims. One of my cases involved a disappearance that turned into a tangle of local corruption and international rumor. It centered on a young woman named Hannah Mills, who vanished after a business trip abroad. Her mother, Sandra Mills, came to me after police closed the inquiry for lack of leads. Hannah had been a marketing consultant with a neat social media presence and a trail of work with designers in the Mediterranean. The initial police inquiry had been perfunctory and the embassy files thin. I opened a private inquiry, reconstructing Hannah's last known movements. This required travel, interviews with airport staff, and working through international red tape. I hired Javier Soto, an immigration lawyer, to advise on cross-border subpoenas. The first break came from an airline employee named Officer Nate Collins, who had seen Hannah boarding a shuttle and chatting with a man who had no luggage. We tracked that man to a hotel where the manager, a retired military man named Oscar Varela, gave a statement but insisted he had turned nothing over to the police. The more we dug, the more we found resistance from local authorities in that region and a chilling pattern of evidence that evaporated between jurisdictions. Documents were altered, CCTV files had gaps, and a hotel logbook had pages torn out. I will not recount every step, but there were at least 4 moments where documents that should have existed did not. At one point, a witness who agreed to testify on camera refused to show in court, citing fear for his family. The public reaction was immediate, and the local paper ran a series of skeptical editorials criticizing our methods while we tried to thread a case through a system ill-equipped for international complexity. I worked to build circumstantial proof by piecing together travel itineraries, calls made from payphones, and bank withdrawals that formed a pattern consistent with human trafficking. That pattern was enough to reopen the case at one point and to force conversations in the prosecutor office about jurisdiction. It was not enough to secure an immediate arrest, but it exposed serious gaps in the way missing person inquiries are handled when they cross borders. Not all of my cases involved foreign intrigue or marauding clinics. One of the most mundane motives produced the most tragic outcome. The fourth case is about greed and a man named Daniel Morgan. He was a handyman who lived quietly in a trailer park and who discovered a small stash of items in a house he was clearing after a death. Daniel found a collection of vintage watches and a single envelope of cash hidden behind a loose floorboard. He thought of selling them to pay bills, and he confided in a friend, Lisa, who told another man named Raul Sanchez. Within a fortnight, Daniel was found late at night on a rural road with blunt force trauma and an intent to intimidate written into the crime scene. The initial investigation by the local police was quick to label it a robbery gone wrong, but neighbors whispered different details. There was a pattern of men who had been in that trailer park and left with their hands in other pockets. I interviewed 5 neighbors, including Tom Briggs and Emma Clark, who described a series of confrontations between Daniel and a small group who believed he had taken money that was owed to them. The scene itself lodged in my memory: the dog of the house shivering and pressed to a leg, the smell of wet embroidery from a poncho that had been dragged, and the metallic tang of blood. The dialogue that night at the small bar near the park was revealing. "He knew too much," Raul said once. Then he laughed and added, "Nobody keeps secrets out here." That laugh was hollow, and it echoed. We pursued witness testimony, but the eyewitness accounts were inconsistent, and the prosecutor later admitted to me that much of the evidence was proof circumstantial. There were no fingerprints on the envelope, no forensic match on the blunt object, and a confessional text message that could have been coerced. This case highlighted how a weak forensic chain and uneven witness testimony can stall a prosecution. The coroner's report provided a cause of death, but not a clear path to an arrest. The result was a community left with a casualty and a feeling of helplessness. You will hear more about the procedural failures that followed in the section. On consequences. One of the deeper and most troubling investigations I handled involved allegations of police corruption tied to an unsolved murder in an area where I had once served. A man named Daniel Morgan, not the same handyman, but a private investigator on the other side of the city, was found murdered near a dock, and the evidence trail suggested involvement of off-duty officers who had business ties to criminal networks. The original homicide unit had closed the case citing lack of evidence, but family members persisted and eventually approached me. The files were thin and at times obstructed by missing interview transcripts and a suspiciously delayed lab analysis. I put together a small team that included former Detective Marcus Reed, an independent forensic accountant named Hannah Cho, and an investigative journalist named Emma Clark who had been following the case for years. We interviewed officers who had once worked the docks, and we reconstructed financial transfers that suggested payoffs and hush money. The key witness, a dock worker named Felipe Morales, agreed to a recorded interview and described seeing the victim arguing with two men in plain clothes the day before he disappeared. The tape captured him saying they were not wearing uniforms, but they had badges in their pockets and they were angry. That testimony shook the investigation because it suggested that the institutional trust people place in law enforcement had been violated. We had to be meticulous. I coordinated with the state prosecutor's office for an independent witness relocation plan because Felipe feared reprisal. The inquest involved repeated requests for disclosure from the police department, and at one point we filed a formal request for an internal affairs inquiry. The internal process produced a report that was largely redacted. We published our findings in the local newspaper and, in coordination with Emma Clark, who wrote a series that pressured authorities into reopening evidence logs and presenting raw data from phone records. The subsequent legal motions centered on probable cause for search warrants and whether evidence had been withheld. The forensic portion required an explanation of how digital forensics could be used to trace geolocation pings from phones, and how cell tower triangulation, when paired with timestamps, can place a person at a specific pier at a specific time. We had geolocation logs, bank withdrawals that coincided with meeting times, and an uncomfortable number of missing surveillance tiles from the port cameras. The case illustrated how corruption corrodes evidence, and how perseverance and cross-discipline cooperation can force transparency but not always justice. Throughout these investigations, there were moments when the tension was so intense that it felt like the room itself had narrowed. One such moment came during a midnight pickup at a motel where I confronted a man connected to human trafficking. We had traced him through bank records, and a witness was prepared to identify him in a lineup. He opened the motel door before the police arrived, and in the single exchange that, "What do you want?" he asked, his voice thick. "I want the girl back," I replied. "You have no idea what you are," he snapped. He then lunged, and another man tried to block me. The motel carpet had a chemical smell. Sweat stuck my shirt to my back, and the cheap fluorescent bulb hummed like an insect. The tactile sensation of the doorknob was slick and cold. I remember the metallic taste in my mouth when the man spat a curse. That confrontation ended with an arrest, but only because the witness later decided to cooperate. The memory of those seconds is a tension that has stayed with me and shaped how I approach interviews and confrontations. Another spine-tightening moment occurred inside a storage unit where we expected to find contraband, but instead found evidence of systematic medical abuse. The air inside was dry and smelled faintly of disinfectant and old cloth. There were chains, a medical tray, and a small cot. The flicker of my flashlight threw shadows across a face mask and a bottle labeled for veterinary use. The combination of visuals, metallic clinks, and the smell of alcohol created a sensory memory that will not leave me. A third moment of tension happened in a courthouse when a witness recanted minutes before giving testimony. The air in the hallway felt like a low-pressure system, and my hands trembled as I paged through the transcript. Moments like these are what create stakes for an investigator and require not only courage but procedural diligence to survive. When I say diligence, I mean the slow, careful work of preserving material so it cannot be dismissed as tainted. There are technical descriptions you need to understand because they decide what evidence stays in play. For example, chain of custody documentation requires that each item be sealed in an evidence bag with a serial number and logged with timestamps and the name of every handler. The handler must sign each transfer, and any break in that chain creates a vulnerability that defense counsel will exploit. Similarly, when we petitioned for search warrants, we had to present affidavits that established probable cause and outlined the specific items to be seized. Vague warrants are easily thrown out. Forensic reports must state methodology, the instruments used, and controls applied, so their findings are reproducible. These procedural steps are tedious, but they are the scaffolding of accountability. Not all paths led to conviction. In the case involving the clinic and the diverted medications, we were able to secure a cooperation agreement from a mid-level staffer who provided an internal ledger and a recorded confession. The prosecutor filed charges and the clinic faced penalties. We saw justice in that case, and I learned how documentation and enhanced audio can flip a narrative. In contrast, the disappearance of Hannah Mills exposed how international boundaries and timid local institutions can turn a search into a series. We pushed the embassy records into public scrutiny, and the story attracted an investigative team from a national newspaper that amplified pressure on local authorities. That did cause them to reopen files, but the process was slow and political. The murder of the handyman, Daniel Morgan, exposed the ways in which small-town complacencies and lack of forensic follow-through leave families without closure. We pursued civil remedies and community pressure, but there were limits to what private investigation can accomplish when evidence is thin. The corruption case with officers revealed a structural rot that required public exposure to prompt change. The independent inquiries that followed led to administrative suspensions and policy reviews, but for families, the outcome felt incomplete. There were specific legal and procedural fights I will not gloss over. In one case, a defense attorney led by Javier Soto argued to suppress audio on the grounds that our surveillance had violated privacy statutes. The motion forced a hearing where we had to demonstrate that the audio was obtained in a public place and with reasonable expectation of conversation under conditions where there was no reasonable expectation of privacy. We presented logs, timestamps, and witness statements that corroborated location and activity. The judge ruled the audio admissible because it met the legal definitions of non-private interchange. In another instance, a motion to exclude evidence on the basis of a faulty search warrant succeeded because the affidavit lacked particularity and the item seized went beyond the scope outlined. That demonstration of procedural failure cost us a crucial piece of physical evidence, and it taught me to be merciless with paperwork. When dealing with forensics, the lab required strict packaging, and I worked closely with Dr. Helen Park to ensure every sample had 2 chain of custody entries and independent verification. As I near the end of these 5 stories, I want to pause and invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. If one of these cases shocked you or reminded you of something you have seen, write "I felt that" in the start of your comment and tell us what you would have done. Your words matter because often these investigations move forward when communities notice patterns. If you have documents or a tip about institutional neglect or trafficking, you can contact organizations like For Victims Now or reach out to a local nonprofit that supports witnesses. Community reporting keeps pressure on authorities, and sometimes it is the single force that moves a hesitant prosecutor to act. If you are reading this and thinking about getting involved, remember to protect your safety and consult a lawyer before making a public allegation. Thank you for being part of a community that seeks truth. The final story on this list is a short, bleak one that, for me, exemplifies how greed and callousness can end a life. It involved a young woman named Taylor Wright who worked nights at a hardware store and went missing after discovering that a neighbor was embezzling funds from a local charity. Taylor had been compiling invoices for the charity and had noticed discrepancies. She confronted the neighbor, a man named Vincent Hale, and within days she vanished. We found her phone in a trash bin 2 blocks away and later recovered a partial skull fragment in a shallow grave the neighbor had dug behind a supply shed. The discovery was gruesome, and the sensory details are painful. The earth was dry and dusty, the smell of rot faint but present. The small fragment had a darkened edge that suggested fire, and the flies were already beginning their work. Witnesses included a teenager named Carlos who admitted to seeing Vincent with a shovel late one night. The trial that followed hinged on forensic anthropology, bead microclimate analysis, and small blood residues that only a meticulous lab could detect. The prosecution presented a chain of evidence and a testimony that linked Vincent to the site. He was convicted and sentenced to a significant term. The motive was small, almost banal, and that made the case feel especially tragic. Taylor had been killed not for passion, but to hide accounting errors and greed. The verdict brought closure in a legal sense, but not in the human sense. Throughout these investigations, I named and relied on a stable of people whose roles were essential. Maria Alvarez, the client who started the first case. Tom Briggs, the neighbor who observed activity around storage units. Dr. Helen Park, the forensic scientist who explained chain of custody and lab controls. Detective Marcus Reed, my old partner, who provided files and backdoor context. Lisa Ortega, my assistant, who managed subpoenas and witness logistics. Javier Soto, the lawyer who navigated international subpoenas and motions. Emma Clark, the journalist who pressured institutions with public reporting, and Officer Nate Collins, who provided initial transit observations. Each of these individuals contributed in specific ways, sometimes as witnesses, sometimes as allies, and sometimes as the conscience that kept a messy process honest. I want to set aside 3 moments of heightened tension that are worth expanding because they reveal both the personal cost and the procedural weight of investigative work. The first occurred in the storage unit raid. We had a warrant that was narrowly drawn, and I remember the feeling of my palm against the cold metal latch as I opened the door. The air inside was stale, musk, and chemical bleeding together, dust motes turning in the beam of my light. We found evidence that suggested medical procedures performed without consent and a set of ledgers with patient initials. The second moment of tension involved a courthouse hallway where a witness recanted minutes before their testimony. The staircase smelled like old polish and coffee, and as I reread their prior statement, I could feel my pulse climb. We had to bring them to a secure room and speak quietly for an hour until they agreed to testify under protection. The third moment was the night I confronted a man at a motel who later turned out to be a trafficker. He opened the door smiling, and then his face hardened. There was a raw, nervous heat in the room. The fluorescent light cut out for a second, and I remember the tactile sensation of the doorknob and the sting of adrenaline as he lunged. Each of these moments lasted seconds, but their consequences stretched for years. Procedural explanation is necessary because these investigations demanded that we respect legal frameworks. When we executed search warrants, the affidavit needed to tie probable cause to specific items with precise language about location. The likelihood of suppression for a vague warrant increases dramatically if the judge believes the search could be arbitrary. To preserve admissibility of physical samples, our team used double sealing with tear-proof bags and logged each transfer. For digital evidence, we created mirror images and used hash algorithms to demonstrate no alteration. These technical steps are not glamorous, but they are the backbone of any case that hopes to survive cross-examination. The consequences of these cases were mixed and often painful. 1 month after the initial complaints in the clinic case, charges were filed against mid-level staff, and a civil suit was pending against the clinic. The woman who brought the storage unit case, Maria Alvarez, had left Tomas and was in a shelter for a time while protection orders were processed and a restraining order was served. A month on, the protection circumstances were improved, and Maria had a lawyer who filed emergency motions. The local newspaper ran our investigative piece, and the community responded with donations and offers of housing support. That first month was chaotic, but it created a protective bubble around the victims while the legal wheels started to turn. 3 months later, the clinic case led to an administrative review at the state level and a change in pharmacy oversight at 2 clinics. The missing person case involving Hannah Mills had produced no arrest, but the new public scrutiny forced the foreign jurisdiction to reopen CCTV footage and to provide a better custody log to the embassy. Our corruption inquiry had prompted an internal affairs inquiry, and 2 officers were temporarily reassigned. The community organized a town hall, and the prosecutor offered a presentation on how to report discrepancies and how to preserve evidence. The 3-month mark is often where the differences between momentum and inertia reveal themselves. In the best cases, resources are mobilized. In others, the attention fades and the file grows cold. 6 months later, some of the results became more durable. The trafficker we arrested at the motel pleaded guilty on multiple counts after prosecutors used the audio evidence, witness testimony, and a cooperation agreement from a smaller player who provided an independent confession. The clinic paid fines and was forced to change record-keeping policies. The corruption case yielded policy reforms at the Police Harbor Commission and Appaldi. Public report recommended greater civilian oversight of port security. The murder of Taylor Wright concluded with a sentence that satisfied a sense of legal justice but could not return what was lost. For Maria Alvarez, the civil suit secured compensation that helped her start over. For families like Hannah Mills, there was still no full closure, but international cooperation mechanisms improved and a non-governmental organization established a hotline that saw increased use. These 6-month outcomes are rarely neat, but they show that persistent investigation, public pressure, and careful procedural work can alter the arc of a case. I will not tell you that every case ends with justice. Too many do not. But I will tell you that documentation, vigilance, and community involvement increase the odds that evidence will be preserved and that accountability will be pursued. If you ever find yourself in a position to help a friend or a neighbor who is facing suspicious disappearances or institutional neglect, remember 3 things. Document everything, record dates and times, and avoid contaminating potential evidence. Photograph scenes, save emails and texts, and write down witness names and contact details. If you suspect illegal activity, report it, and consider consulting an attorney or a nonprofit that supports witnesses. Do not assume the system will act without pressure. Cases often turn because someone keeps asking questions. If one of these stories moved you, please comment with "I felt that" at the start of your message and share what you would have done. For those who want to be involved in a safer way, share resources, contact local advocacy organizations, and support centers for victims. If you have documents related to a case you think is mishandled, consider reaching out to a journalist or to an attorney specializing in civil rights. Your hands can be an engine for accountability. If you want to see more investigations like these, subscribe and join a community that values careful reporting and methodical inquiry. The work is slow and the victories are often partial, but they matter. In the end, the cases left me with 2 abiding impressions. One is that systems can fail in ordinary and predictable ways, and that a small group of determined people can push those systems to be better. The other is that the human cost of failure is real and enduring. I still dream sometimes in the same rhythm as an evidence log, and I still wake with the smell of a storage unit or the taste of motel coffee. I have learned that truth is not a single event, but a thread that must be pulled and examined patiently. If you have information that can help a case, if you are a witness who fears coming forward, reach out to trusted advocates and insist on legal counsel. If you are a public servant or part of an institution, remember that diligence is not optional. The truth does not ask permission. It only requires someone brave enough to look.